What is going on, everybody? My name is Michael Levan. I'm here with Mark from Codiac, and we are going to be talking about proprietary software. We've been talking about it since the 60s. We're now bringing it into 2024. We're not in 2025 yet. What's going on, man? How are you?
Good, good. It's a huge topic.
Yeah.
This thing. It's been near and dear to my heart quite a bit, because I've been on the development side for a couple decades. I've been on the DevOps side for several years, and I've been on the consulting side. So I've gotten a lot of the feedback from existing teams. I've gotten the, gosh, I really wish I could have been playing over there, or I heard of this really cool tech, but we can't do it because our team is this way. And so that whole thing about, well, let's be agnostic, let's go follow the standards, let's go do all that. That's like a little sort of it's a white whale that, we may have been talking about since the 60s, in that same sense, you know what I mean? You've probably come across that quite a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, people want to say, we want to look at it and be like, what we should be doing? The way things should be, it should be like this. Things should operate this way. But we all know in the practicality, it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah, I started off my career on the Microsoft Windows side. So I started out in systems administration, but on Windows Server, and that was obviously totally proprietary. I mean, there was that's what we did. We were a Microsoft shop. That was it. And now we kind of fast forward into 2024, and you still have proprietary software, but everything's a lot more open now. AWS talks to Azure, and this one talks to GCP, and you can use Azure AD or whatever they call it now, Entra, I think, to do RBAC for Kubernetes in EKS. So it's there are so many different ways to kind of interloop all these pieces, and then also there's the multi-cloud thing, and there's the hybrid cloud, and so it's still proprietary, but at the same time, they're coming together in a sense.
You could put together a mixed bag,
right?
No question, and there's a lot more probably than before layers too. The fact is, you're never going to get around the fact that somebody at some point has to speak AWS to talk to an AWS box.
Right.
The question is how many layers are there on top of that, and is there enough abstraction? And that's kind of where. You want to say, well, now that we start approaching this moment of, we've got cloud out there, we've got IAC running like madfire, and we've got all kinds of different products that are trying to bring those pieces together, aggregators and everything, so that mixed bag's possible. But then, for me at least, this is one of the things I think about as I'm staring at the ceiling. Maybe we actually got there. Maybe we have enough layers now. Maybe there is enough good tech now. Maybe the IAC and the cloud and the standards and the security and the Auth0, for instance, is a great example of an aggregator. That and a good SSO or any good SSO program can give you that basis to say, well, this is going to help us integrate all these various pieces. I think the challenge I've always had is okay, that's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
And it's you have to speak, and this is I think the challenge today, right? You have to speak all these languages. Your job, what you do is as a service to the people. Right. Mike is going out there and he's evaluating all these different players and products and saying, hey, this one's good, and this is what I thought about that one, and maybe, and you're not saying this online, maybe Mark. This is the thing that's going to connect the dots for you, and you're going to have that agnostic setup. And we're doing some of this at Codiac, where we took some of that spirit, and we said, look, let's say that you can jailbreak your enterprise. Yeah. Let's say you've got that AWS team or you've got that Azure team, and you want to say, well, I want to be able to put one environment over here on Azure, and I want to put another environment over here on AWS, and another environment over here on GCP, and another one on this third-party service that we want to use. Well, how do we do that? And it's well, that's planning for meticulous, crazy people like me, supported by crazy people like you that are looking at all these. Yeah, that could work, Mark.
Right. Yeah, I feel like the closest. So I started playing around with Codiac, and I saw that we got closer. But before Codiac, I think the closest that we were able to get was something like a Terraform provider. Because the idea of a Terraform provider, the idea of Terraform in general is you're writing HCL the same way for wherever you're working, on-prem, AWS, GCP, doesn't matter. The only thing that you have to do is bring down a provider to talk to that API. Why? Because the APIs aren't open.
Yeah.
So it's I think if we were ever going to get to like remove the idea of proprietary, you would have to have the ability to have those APIs open.
Right.
And they're not going to do that. so the second, I think after the whole idea of like a Terraform provider, we've gotten a step closer, and that step closer, in my opinion, is Codiac. Like you have the ability to use something like Codiac or use Codiac, central place, AWS, Azure, soon GCP, and just about everything else, right? The local cluster stuff, which you've been having a ton of fun with over the past couple of weeks. And with that, it's like you have this central, it's like a central location that's decentralized.
Yeah, well, it's definitely another layer.
Yeah.
You know, we're walking in saying, let's add another layer. And when we were saying, like, hey, there's all those languages and all that crazy stuff you're speaking, that you have to speak to connect all those dots.
Right.
Well, we said, well, let's add a layer that does a lot of that nonsense. You know, you shouldn't call it nonsense, but a lot of that busy work and that meticulous, well, this one talks this way and that one talks this way, but they're both talking about the same thing. Can we abstract that? That's essentially what that layer is doing. So are we there yet? Well, you can be in certain teams, and in some ways not. You know, I think the idea of, for instance, HashiCorp Terraform Cloud, and Terraform Cloud is a phenomenal place to centrally execute and manage your IAC, whatever it ends up doing to whatever. The idea for us is that that's great that you can do that, and it's phenomenal. It's a beautiful thing. The other thing that's attached to that is all the DevOps work and all the hard effort, blood, and sacrifice that has to go into making sure that those packages that you have now tie into what's this, agnostic or this fluent. I've even heard people talk about no ops team, and well, somebody's got to pull those strings, right? And so the idea is like, well, what if we said, like Kodiak right now is doing its own IAC because we had to build the first one, but the concept would be that, let's take software over here in containers, and let's take IAC over here, two very moving, very, very fast-moving, perpetually operating engines that are going to be evolving over time. We know it, right? Well, the hassle of dealing between those is where that layer was missing, and I think we add that new layer. Now you can say, well, we've abstracted packages that happen to live out over here at HashiCorp, or happen to live on one of our servers, or happen to live in our own little container over here, wherever we want to put our IAC. Well, if we could speak a general language about it now, we could just fire it at the right time. Right. And that right time fits into the SLC. I'm going to go off on Kodiak here. I don't mean to do that.
No. I know we weren't even going to talk about it, but I feel like we have to, because now we're in this conversation and I want to talk about it. This idea of this central configuration, like the dynamic configurations, right, within Kodiak. And Ben knows that like it took me a little bit to get up to the idea of like what Kodiak was doing. Like my perception of what Kodiak was when I first started working with Kodiak to now is drastically different, right? And I think that the reason why is because it's implementing something new that we haven't seen. Like we haven't seen this centralized, decentralized orchestrator of sorts. And I hate the word orchestrator because it's thrown around too much, but this centralized location that is decentralized based on where your workloads are and what data you want to be able to send to those workloads. And I think we were talking about this at some point, but the closest that we've gotten for something like that in the world of Kubernetes is maybe like a customized configuration or a Helm chart where you can set up your Kubernetes manifests in multiple different environments, dev, staging, UAT, whatever, and then send them out to where they need to go. But Kodiak is obviously taking this a step further as well because it's no YAML configurations. You can bring your own if you want to, but you don't have to worry about those configurations. You worry about, here's this box, right? We'll call that dynamic configs, and within dynamic configs, you have all of your applications here, if they're containerized applications or they're called assets in Kodiak. And then what you do is based on that application, you put in your replicas or your annotations or whatever it is. And then they just sit there. And it doesn't matter where you're deploying your asset, your container. AWS, Azure, dev environment, prod environment, doesn't matter. You manage these central configurations right here, and you never have to touch them again unless you want to do an update based on environment. And that's not something we've seen. So this is, in my opinion, the next level, the next iteration.
Well, let's put it this way. Let's give credit to all those silent folks out there that have broken their backs to implement it internally, right? Like anybody who has taken on the whole business of platform engineering has done something like this.
Yeah.
You know, it was just maybe it didn't get finished, which happens all the time, or it did get finished, but there's only one guy that can manage it, or it's just internal to this one team. We've been working on it. I've actually met companies that have said, we've been working on this thing for 5 years. We got it pretty good at this point, you know? And it's like, I know from going through this, from building Codiac, that is not easy.
Yeah.
It is the exact question of like design to make something, a complex thing simple is the hardest thing on the planet. You know, like that's the hardest point of design to do, to make really this complicated thing easy to use and easy to understand. And that's the whole point here. It's like, yeah, there's the central config that you're talking about, and then you can modify it. You're gonna say, well, that environment operates a little differently. We need a little more scale in that environment, or these types of nodes need to operate differently over here. You can adjust that in a strategic merge, essentially. But in Kodiak, it just plays out. It's relatively simple. But the thing is, it's relatively simple for everybody on the team to understand, and for you to bring from project to project to project. It's sort of like, well, now we're kind of coming around saying that's science. You know, that is a new layer, a new standard maybe we should be following, and we just said, well, let's pick that ball up and we'll make that work. You know, so that's it's a big part of it. But again, the huge challenge there is there's a lot of meticulous data and meticulous work that goes into it. And a lot of people sit around and go, there is no way in hell anybody else could make work what I just did. Or I've done an enormous amount of code here. I don't care how good you say that product is, it's not going to do this. Right. You know, and you've been there, right? Like, this is my masterpiece, don't touch it! Yeah. But they are masterpieces. I mean, you're accomplishing glorious things in that sense, and you're scaling, and you've got this thing down to a button push, and you could write books about that stuff. Well, I think the time, like you were talking about, is like now the time's come to say, let's take what we know about that process, let's productize it, let's standardize on it a little bit, and let's leave evolution to happen in the IAC side, evolution to happen in the cloud providers, and evolution to happen in the container world, and say like, let's, again, okay, we won't say orchestrate, but let's manage that with the software development lifecycle language. Everybody speaks on SDLC.
And you said something interesting before about these organizations. You have a set of engineers. These engineers build this thing, and then at that point, it's like, don't friggin' touch it. It's working. It's going to continue to work. That could be considered a form of proprietary data.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, your own proprietary. Yeah.
Right. So you say, I have to do this thing, and this is what we do, and that's it. But let's take a couple different types of workloads, right? Well, let's take one workload where you're doing something GPU-centric, right? Something graphical, LLM, or whatever you're doing. And then you take something that's maybe like WASM-specific. And then you take something that's maybe legacy, right? Like maybe you're running Windows containers for legacy .NET software. And maybe the fourth one is just general applications running, in a Kubernetes environment, right? Containerized. Mm-hmm. So you got 4 different things, and that's going to be really hard for organizations because each of those things have different workflows, right? The way that it's set up, the way that you're deploying, what environments they're going to. Yeah. But in Kodiak, it's all the same thing.
That's the idea, totally.
It's all the same thing.
Well, I mean, isn't that what we need at this point? That's what, when people talk about that again, the white whale of like, we should just be able to take our thing, move it over here, or you talk GPU, right? Yeah. Like, GPUs are expensive. Yeah. People are competing all over the place for them, and everybody who has this conversation, at least with me, at some point drifts into, maybe this is to humor me, but drifts into this topic of like, there are a lot of deals happening, a lot of competitors playing to get your business on the GPU compute. And so you're going to start to find, as we move forward, that there is a phenomenal deal for running your AI workloads on GPUs under GCP. And, well, that's great, but we can't move to that. Right. I can't move to GCP because I don't have the flexibility, the portability to do that. Right. And some academic like myself would come in, I'm not an academic, but somebody with an academic mind, who's been thinking these things should come in and be like, no, you don't have to. If you just follow all these topics all the way, if you follow all these procedures, you should be able to move that over with no problem at all. It's like, we all know not to believe that person.
And it's relatively straightforward. I mean, like I did this in Kodiak where I had the same application, the same settings for that application, because they're all sitting in dynamic configs, and I had one sitting in one environment running on AWS, and then the other one sitting in another environment running in Azure.
Yeah.
Totally different architectures. Kubernetes is arguably different in each, because even though Kubernetes is the same underneath the hood, the cloud providers get their hands on it, and then they sprinkle their goodness into it. So arguably different architectures, but I am able to just literally click a button and drag and drop this application from one to another, and that's it. That's all I have to do. Like, this is, and I know we've spoken about like so many different terminologies for Kodiak, right? Like, what do you call it? A platform engineering environment, a hybrid cloud environment, a multi-cloud environment? It's just doing all of it.
It's standing on top of giants, basically. And when you say, well, it's a drag and drop to move it over, I was talking to somebody recently who was like, well, how are you able to do that? Because mine's different, and this is different, and that's different. Like, in fact, what really happens is at some point in the game, you told Kodiak about every last piece of that thing. Like, you said, like, hey, this is my general config, and maybe I just upload it all. Or maybe I told you to take the defaults. Or I have this container. Well, Kodiak remembers that all the way through, and so it uses that. So at one point I was describing it like Kodiak's like a bunch of nouns. If you look at IAC is nouns and verbs and sentences that they put together. We've said, no, we store your nouns. And then you give us a verb, and we assemble those nouns with that verb and send it out. And so we store a lot less data, and it's easier to get a hold of, and it's easier to reuse. But the point is that it gets us to that moment, what we've been talking about, where we can say, look, there is glorious IAC over here, and I don't really care about that right now. The guy who built the IAC definitely does, and I'm glad I'm using that guy, and I'm glad we're relying on that. And we can stand on that guy's back now and just say, I've brought it all into a button push. Because ultimately the intuition that you have when you're doing that is, I need this version over here on that place.
Yeah.
And what's the difference between the compute over here and compute over there? Well, they're named differently and they're configured differently, but that's not in this layer.
And it's interesting because even if we think about things from like a cluster perspective, HCL is HCL, right? That's the Terraform language underneath the hood. It's always going to look the same, right? Your resource blocks, how you're bringing in variables, everything. But I can tell you that the code block to create an AKS cluster versus the code block to create an EKS cluster, it's drastically different in size.
Yep.
It's drastically different in the resources that you need to bring in. So like, for example, in AKS, very straightforward. In EKS, because worker nodes and the control plane are still considered separate, the node pools are considered separate, whereas in AKS, you can bundle them together. You have to attach different policies for your control plane to be able to talk to EC2. And there's a bunch of different policies to do that. So like, point being is, there's a bunch of different pieces to this puzzle that you still have to be thinking about, when in reality, you shouldn't have to.
At the right time.
Right.
Right? So you would like to say, I just built this sick EKS deployment system, and great. And I wired it into Kodiak, so now it's drag and drop whenever anybody needs it, and everybody can use that. Like, that's really where we're headed with it. And right now, the status quo is what you're saying. Like, yeah, you've got to build that sick thing, but that sick thing is only available under those sick conditions and all those sick scripts that go along with it, right?
Yeah.
You want to wire it into a standard so that it's available at all those points in the SDLC workflow, the standard SDLC workflow, not the proprietary one. Like, anyway, no, it's an exciting idea. It's a rough road trying to bring that in, and I think the rough is part of it, though. We've put in a lot of late nights trying to put that stuff together, understand what those nuances are, and bring them out in a standard way that works for everybody. But it's really communicating it, is the really hard thing. Like you said, like even you got started with it and you thought one thing about it, and then learned over time it has a different position in the workflow.
And I think the hardest part about that is because our brains always sit in a certain way that it's like, this is the way things are. Even if we see the world differently, we're almost so structured to look at engineering in a particular way that we forget that it could be something different. Yeah,
well, I think that's a really good point to maybe close on, is that like, there's always the what could it be? Especially now. There's so much good tech, and there's so many good tools, and so many people putting together tools that work with other tools, like you say. Like, it's out there. I mean, it's almost like they're asking us to put this thing together. Like, we should be thinking a lot more about what could be or should be, because the opportunities are there. The tech is there. You know, the standards are there.
Yeah, I think we officially have the ability to, even though there's always going to be things that are proprietary between Azure, GCP, AWS, everybody in between, but we certainly have a way to interact with it in a non-proprietary fashion. I think that'll be the middle ground, at least for right now, until Azure and AWS and GCP decide to just give us all the source code to everything.
That should at least be a big part of the plan. Of course. So we'll wait for that.
Exactly, yeah. But in the meantime,
in the meantime, that should be part. It should be part of the plan. At least. We've discussed that. We checked it out.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I think I'm good.
No, awesome. Well, Mark, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Great conversation. Thank you, everybody, for watching, listening. Hope you got some value. Check out Kodiak. Go try it out for free. You can go to that website, click the register button, walk through a couple of panels, and that's
Kodiak.io.
That's it. There we go.
Look us up on LinkedIn, too. We'll definitely get back to you.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, everybody.